a Navy SEAL, a dead brother, a ring no one understood. He fixed your broken doors, he replaced your burnt-out bulbs. He walked past you every morning, and you never looked twice. But when a hidden device threatened to bring down the most secured building in the country, with senators, generals, and the President of the United States inside, the only man who saw it coming was the one everyone had already decided didn't matter. His name is Caleb Danner, and this is the story they tried to erase. If this hits you, drop a like and comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay until the end. You'll want to be here for what happens. The fluorescent light in Corridor 7 had been flickering for 11 days. Caleb Danner had filed the work order on day 1, been told it was low priority on day 3, and by day 9 had simply stopped waiting and climbed the ladder himself. That was how things worked here. You filed the request. You waited. Nothing happened. Then you did it anyway, on your own time, without anyone asking and without anyone noticing. He was 40 feet up the maintenance ladder when his radio crackled. "Danner, you in 7? "Yeah." "There's a water intrusion issue in the east mechanical room. Someone left a panel off last night and the humidity sensor's been reading wrong all morning. Conference Ops wants it sorted before noon." He checked his watch. It was 8:47. "Copy," he said. "Give me 10 minutes." He finished swapping the fluorescent tube. The old one had a hairline crack along the casing, slow oxidation, not an electrical fault, then climbed down and walked the length of the corridor alone. His boots made almost no sound on the polished concrete floor. That had always been true of him, the quiet footfall, the tendency to move through spaces without disturbing them. Old habit, the kind that never fully left. Jefferson Federal Conference Center sat on the west edge of the city and hosted roughly 40 major events per year: trade delegations, security summits, occasionally the kind of gathering that required an outer perimeter of unmarked vehicles and men with earpieces who didn't make eye contact with the staff. Caleb had been working here for 3 years. He knew every electrical panel, every pressure valve, every access corridor that wasn't on the public floor map. He knew where the HVAC system ran loud enough to cover a conversation and where the dead zones were in the wireless network coverage. He knew the building the way you only know a place when you've spent years making sure it doesn't fall apart. What the building didn't know, and what nobody in this job had ever thought to ask, was what Caleb Danner had been before he became the man who fixed the lights. He didn't volunteer it. He'd learned early that volunteering it created a specific kind of reaction, either disbelief or the worse version, the uncomfortable over-respect from people who wanted to shake your hand and thank you for your service, and then go back to ignoring everything you said. He'd decided both were exhausting, so he kept his head down and did the work. He found the east mechanical room panel hanging off its hinge. Someone had left it open overnight during a cable routing job and hadn't logged the access. The humidity sensor had spiked to 38% because of an unsealed junction above the secondary HVAC intake. It took him 6 minutes to reseal it, 2 more to recalibrate the sensor, and another 4 to document it properly in the maintenance log, because if he didn't do that, someone else would have to come back and do it again in 3 weeks and still wouldn't know why. He was closing the log when he noticed the cable. It wasn't supposed to be there. Not because it looked obviously out of place. That was the thing. It was positioned well, tucked along the existing cable routing, color-coded to match the surrounding network lines. Someone who didn't know this room wouldn't look twice. But Caleb had spent 3 years in this room, and he knew every cable run in it. He knew which ones had been installed in the original build and which had been added during the 2019 infrastructure upgrade. He could tell you the purpose of each one. This one didn't have a purpose he recognized. He crouched down and followed it with his eyes, not touching it. It ran from the secondary data port, which shouldn't have had anything connected to it. That port was for emergency overflow only, and traced along the base of the wall behind the cooling unit, disappearing into a conduit that fed up toward the building's central security hub. Caleb stayed very still for a moment. Then he took 3 photographs with his work phone, documented the location and timestamp in his notes, and went to find his supervisor. Gary Mott had worked building operations at Jefferson Federal for 9 years and prided himself on running a clean, calm ship. He was a steady, square-shouldered man who genuinely cared about his team and genuinely did not want problems. Not because he was lazy, because in his experience, problems in a building like this one in a week like this one, with the National Security Conference 2 days away, were the kind of thing that produced paperwork for months. "Show me," he said, when Caleb explained. Caleb showed him the photographs. Gary studied them. That could be a legacy line from the 2019 work. Some of that routing was sloppy. You know Ridgway's crew. "I know Ridgway's crew," Caleb said. "That's not their work. That's too clean. And it's connected to the secondary data port on the security backbone, Gary. That port shouldn't have anything plugged into it." Gary handed the phone back. "I'll have somebody look at it." "I think somebody needs to look at it today." "Caleb." Gary's voice shifted to the particular register that meant he was about to say something reasonable in a way that ended the conversation. "We've got 48 hours until the biggest event this building has hosted in 4 years. I've got contractors in 3 wings, a catering setup in the East Ballroom, and the Carrington team coming in at 2 o'clock for a final systems review. I hear what you're saying. I'll get somebody to look at it." Caleb stood for a moment in the doorway of Gary's office. He recognized the shape of this exchange. It was familiar the way a lot of things from a former life were familiar. The way a person tells you they've heard you while communicating with complete clarity that nothing is going to change because of what you said. "All right," he said. "It's documented." "It's always documented with you," Gary said, and he meant it as a compliment, and Caleb accepted it as one and went back to work. He called his daughter at 12:15 when he knew her lunch break started. Tessa was 7, and she had recently developed strong opinions about sandwiches. Specifically, she believed that cutting a sandwich diagonally into triangles made it taste different from cutting it into rectangles, and she was not wrong in any way that he could argue with, so he'd stopped trying to argue. He cut them diagonally now. She reported back on how they tasted. This was a significant part of their daily communication. "How was the sandwich?" he said. "Good," she said. "The triangles were a little smaller today. I used a smaller piece of bread." "Oh." She processed this with the gravity it deserved. "That's okay. Do you have to work late tonight?" "Probably till 6. Mrs. Aldridge has you until then. She makes me watch game shows. Game shows are educational. Dad, you learn vocabulary." "Dad, nobody talks like that." He was standing in the loading dock at the side of the building, out of the wind, and he smiled at the pavement in front of his boots. "Go eat your triangles," he said. "I'll pick you up at 6. We'll figure out dinner on the way home." "Can we get the noodles?" "We can talk about noodles." "That means yes," she said confidently, and hung up. He stood there for another few seconds with the phone in his hand, then put it back in his pocket and went inside. The Carrington Strategic Systems team arrived at 1:55 in the afternoon, 5 minutes ahead of schedule. Caleb was replacing a proximity sensor on one of the secondary entrance panels near the main atrium when they came through. He noticed them the way he noticed most things. Not by staring, but by cataloging. 4 security consultants in charcoal suits, 2 technical specialists carrying cases, a PR liaison who looked like she hadn't slept, and at the center of it, moving without hesitation and apparently conducting 3 separate conversations simultaneously, Evelyn Carrington. He'd seen photographs of her before, in the building's event materials. The photographs hadn't prepared him for the actual quality of her attention. She wasn't performing authority. She just had it. She was in the middle of a sentence with one of her consultants while simultaneously reading something on her tablet, and when a junior staffer tried to interrupt her with a question about the AV setup in Room C, she answered it without looking up and without losing the thread of the conversation she was already in. She was also, he noticed, walking directly toward the East Mechanical Room. He didn't follow her. That wasn't his job. But he flagged Gary over the radio. "The Carrington team is heading toward the East Corridor. You might want to make sure someone walks them through the mechanical room situation." There was a pause. "What situation?" "The cable I found this morning." Another pause. "I thought I had Kowalski look at it." "Did Kowalski look at it?" "I'll check," Gary said, in the voice of a man who had not checked. Caleb finished the proximity sensor, logged the work order as completed, and spent the next 4 hours doing his job, which was what he always did. He was up in the ceiling of the main conference hall, tracing an intermittent power issue in the secondary lighting grid, when he heard the commotion below. He couldn't make out words, but he could make out tone. Someone was irritated. Not panicked, but the particular pitch of irritated that meant a problem had surfaced at an inconvenient time and someone needed to decide what to do about it. He finished securing the connection he was working on. Loose terminal block, third junction from the east wall. He noted it meticulously and climbed down. The scene in the security coordination room was Gary, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Two of the Carrington technical specialists, a man named Preston Vale, who was a senior executive at Carrington and who Caleb had encountered twice before at site visits, and found to be the kind of person who made his status known within the first 90 seconds of any conversation. And Evelyn Carrington, standing at the security monitoring station with her arms crossed, and a look on her face that was measuring something. Caleb appeared in the doorway. "I can show you where I found it," he said. Everybody looked at him. "Danner," Gary said, they're doing the systems review. I know. I found the device this morning. I can walk them through exactly where it is and what I observed when I documented it." Preston Vale looked at him the way people look at someone who has just wandered into the wrong room. "Your maintenance. I'm the maintenance technician who found the anomaly in your security backbone, yeah." Vale's eyes dropped to Caleb's hand, to the ring on his right hand, a silver band, worn smooth in places, with a small compass rose etched into its face. Old. Clearly old. The kind of thing you didn't put on one morning and take off at night. "Is that a service ring?" Vale said, and his voice had a specific quality that Caleb recognized instantly. Not curiosity, setup. "It belonged to my brother," Caleb said. "Your brother was Navy?" Vale said. "Or is this one of those—" He gestured vaguely with one hand, a gesture that completed the sentence in the most dismissive way possible without actually saying the words. The room went quiet. Caleb looked at Preston Vale steadily. He'd been looked at like this before. Not by better men, just by men with more expensive suits who'd learned that status could be weaponized and had never had cause to unlearn that lesson. "The device," Caleb said, "is connected to the secondary data port on the East Building security backbone. It's not a legacy cable. The routing gauge and insulation type are different from everything else in that conduit. It wasn't in the 2019 infrastructure documentation, and I've been through that documentation twice since this morning." Evelyn Carrington uncrossed her arms. She looked at Caleb for a moment, then looked at Gary. "This is your maintenance tech?" "Yes," Gary said. "Has anyone else physically examined what he found?" A pause that was slightly too long. "I had someone scheduled, so no," she said. "We can have our technical team walk the space right now," one of the Carrington specialists said. 30 minutes. We'll have a full assessment." Evelyn nodded. She started to turn back to the monitoring station, then stopped. She looked at Caleb again, not unkindly, but directly. "The ring," she said. "I'd ask that you keep it less visible during the conference. We have a brand image to maintain with our clients, and the optics of—" "I'm not taking it off," Caleb said. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't loud. It was just the flattest possible statement of a thing that was not going to change. Evelyn Carrington held his gaze for a moment. Something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, more like adjusting, recalibrating slightly against something she hadn't expected. Then she nodded once, minimal, and turned back to the room. 30 minutes, she said to her team. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Caleb went back to work. He finished the sealing junction in the main conference hall. He replaced a worn gasket on the loading dock's hydraulic door. He checked in on the HVAC calibration he'd done that morning, still reading clean. He ate a protein bar, standing over the maintenance sink at 4:30, because he'd forgotten to bring a real lunch and the vending machine on the second floor had been out of anything edible for 6 days, which he'd also filed a work order on. At 5:15, Gary found him in the utility corridor near the north wing. "Carrington team says the cable is probably legacy infrastructure that wasn't properly logged," Gary said. Caleb looked at him. "They did a signal trace, found nothing active." "A signal trace," Caleb said. "That's what they said." "Gary, a signal trace won't show you a device that's in standby mode. It'll only register when it's active. If whoever installed it is smart enough to hide it in a conduit with matching gauge cable, they're smart enough to set it to go live on a timer or a remote trigger." Gary rubbed the back of his neck. I hear you, but the Carrington team is satisfied, and Evelyn Carrington signed off on the security assessment. There's not a lot I can do if the people who get paid to evaluate this say it's fine. Caleb was quiet for a moment. The corridor hummed faintly with the building's breath, the ventilation system cycling, the dull resonance of a structure that contained multitudes. He'd spent 3 years learning to hear this building. He knew the sound of when it was right and the sound of when something was wrong. He was hearing the second one now, and no signal trace was going to convince him otherwise. All right, he said. He picked up his tools. He clocked out at 5:58, drove to Mrs. Aldridge's house, and picked up Tessa, who was in an excellent mood despite the game shows and had apparently learned the correct use of the word peninsula from a geography round. They got the noodles. Tessa talked about peninsulas the entire way home. Caleb listened and answered when she needed answers, and drove with one hand on the wheel and the silver ring catching the last of the evening light through the windshield. He had 2 days before the conference. He didn't sleep well that night. He was back in the building by 6:15 the next morning. Not because his shift started at 6:15, it started at 7:30, but because he hadn't been able to stop thinking about the cable, and thinking about things without being able to act on them was something Caleb had never been good at. He'd tried after he left the teams. He tried the version of himself that sat still and let things go and trusted other people to handle what needed handling. That version had lasted about 4 months before he accepted it wasn't going to stick. So he came in early. He badged through the loading dock entrance, nodded at the overnight security guard, a retired county sheriff named Hector who always had coffee and never asked questions, and went straight to the East Mechanical room. The cable was still there. Of course it was still there. He hadn't expected anyone to remove it. What he hadn't expected was what he found when he crouched down and looked more carefully at the device it connected to, using a small flashlight from his kit rather than the overhead fluorescents, which cast the wrong kind of light for detail work. The casing was matte black, about the size of a paperback novel, and it was secured to the back wall of the conduit with 2 industrial adhesive mounts. Standard enough. What wasn't standard was the small etched mark on the lower left corner of the casing. Barely visible, the kind of thing you'd miss entirely if you weren't looking at exactly the right angle with exactly the right light. It was a stylized symbol, geometric, a series of intersecting lines that formed something close to a broken compass rose. Caleb stared at it for a long moment. Then he took 6 photographs from different angles, stood up, and stood very still in the mechanical room while the building hummed around him and something cold moved through his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. He knew that symbol. He didn't know yet what it meant that it was here, but he knew he'd seen it before, and the memory of where sat at the back of his mind like something that hadn't fully surfaced yet, pressing upward from a depth he didn't spend much time looking into. He went to his locker, changed into his work clothes, and started his shift. The conference center was a different place 24 hours before a major event. The ordinary rhythms of the building, the quiet mornings, the predictable foot traffic, the long stretches of maintenance work that were mostly just Caleb and whatever system needed attention, all of that gave way to something louder and more chaotic and considerably harder to navigate. Contractors moved through every corridor. The catering company had taken over the East Ballroom and was conducting what appeared to be a full military-scale logistics operation, involving several hundred folding chairs. A woman from the event planning office kept appearing at random locations and asking Caleb if the ambient lighting in the pre-function area could be warmed up a little. And each time he explained that the lighting system was what it was, and warmth was not a setting he could dial in without rewiring 3 fixtures, and each time she nodded as if she understood and then reappeared 40 minutes later to ask again. He got through the morning on routine work. He had the photographs on his phone and a knot in his stomach that he was managing the way he always managed those things, which was by putting them in a separate compartment and functioning around them until he had time to deal with them properly. At 11 o'clock, he found Gary in the operations office and closed the door behind him. "I need you to look at something," Caleb said. Gary was eating a sandwich and doing 3 things on his computer and looked like a man who had already used up most of his available patience before noon. "If this is about the cable, it's about the device the cable connects to." Caleb put his phone on the desk and showed Gary the photographs. The close-up of the casing, the mounting hardware, the symbol on the lower corner. Gary chewed. He looked at the photographs with the expression of a man trying to decide whether what he was seeing was actually a problem or just something that looked like a problem to someone who was predisposed to find problems. It could be a manufacturer's mark, he said. I looked up every manufacturer that makes network infrastructure devices in that form factor. None of them use that mark. You looked up. Gary set his sandwich down. Caleb, when did you have time to look that up? This morning, before my shift. Gary was quiet for a moment. You came in early. I couldn't sleep. Because of a cable. Because of a device connected to the security backbone of a building that's about to host the National Security Conference with several hundred high-value federal personnel inside it, Caleb said, keeping his voice level. Yeah, because of that. Gary picked up the phone and looked at the photographs again. Caleb watched him look at them and could see the moment when Gary wanted to dismiss it, and the moment when some instinct he probably didn't fully trust told him that dismissing it might be the wrong call, and the moment when the pressure of everything else he had to deal with today won out over that instinct. I'll flag it for the Carrington team again, Gary said. I'll make sure they do a full physical inspection, not just a signal trace. I'd like to be there when they do. Gary looked at him. Why? Because I found it. Because I know what I saw. And because if they're going to wave it off again, I'd like to hear their reasoning directly. Gary considered this. I'll see what I can do, he said, which meant probably not, but he'd try. Which meant he wouldn't try very hard, but he wasn't going to tell Caleb to drop it either. It was the best available outcome. Thank you, Caleb said, and meant it, and went back to work. The Carrington team's afternoon session was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the main security coordination room. Caleb was not invited. He found this out from Gary at 1:45, delivered with a look that communicated apology and helplessness in roughly equal measure. Preston Vale specifically said the technical review was internal to their team and the facility operations staff, Gary said. I'm facility operations staff. He meant, you know what he meant, Caleb. Caleb knew what he meant. All right, he said, and went to replace a worn door seal on the main entrance because it had been on his list for 2 weeks, and today seemed like as good a day as any. He was crouched in the entrance vestibule with his back to the atrium, working on the seal's lower corner where the adhesion had failed, when he heard the voices. The atrium had a particular acoustic quality, high ceilings, hard floors, a shape that carried sound in unexpected directions. And the conversation from the hallway outside the security coordination room traveled to him more clearly than anyone in that hallway would have expected. Preston Vale's voice was easy to identify. It had a specific timbre that Caleb associated with men who had spent a long time being listened to and had started to confuse that with being worth listening to. Not going to let a maintenance tech derail the timeline over a cable he probably doesn't understand. Another voice, one of the Carrington technical specialists, said something Caleb couldn't make out. I don't care what his theory is. We have a signal assessment, and it came back clean. That's the standard. That's what we tell the client. Then Evelyn's voice, quieter, more controlled. We do a physical inspection, full access, not just the security hub. I want someone in that mechanical room today. A pause. Then Vale again. The particular flatness of a man who has just been overruled and has decided the gracious response is to comply while making clear he finds the whole thing unnecessary. Fine, after the briefing. Caleb went back to the door seal. He didn't feel vindicated exactly. He felt tired, the way you feel when a thing you already knew turns out to be true, and the only prize for being right is that the work continues. What? The physical inspection happened at 4:30. Caleb was there because Evelyn Carrington sent someone to find him specifically, which he suspected Vale had not anticipated and had not enjoyed. The Carrington specialist who led the inspection was a woman named Renata, compact and precise, with the focused economy of movement that Caleb associated with people who had been trained by the military or by someone trained by the military. She went through the mechanical room methodically, starting at the door and working inward. She didn't rush. She didn't narrate what she was doing for anyone's benefit. She just worked. When she got to the cable and the device, she crouched down and looked at it for a long time without touching it. You found this yesterday morning? She said, not looking up. Around 8:50. Caleb said, and you didn't touch it. I photographed it. That's all. She nodded once. She took her own photographs. Then she produced a scanner from her kit, smaller and more sophisticated than anything the building's security team carried, and ran it along the length of the cable and over the casing of the device. She looked at the scanner's readout and didn't say anything for several seconds. Preston Vale was standing in the doorway. "Well?" he said. Renata stood up. She looked at Vale, then at Evelyn. Then, and this was the part Caleb noticed, she looked at Caleb. "It's in passive mode," she said. "The signal trace yesterday came back clean because it wasn't transmitting. But the hardware signature is—" She stopped. "This isn't infrastructure equipment. This is a monitoring and control device. It's been designed to look like infrastructure equipment, but the internal architecture is different." The room was quiet. "What does it control?" Evelyn said. "I need more time to trace the full routing, but based on where it's connected..." Renata glanced at the security backbone port. "Potentially everything. Door systems, camera feeds, the emergency protocols." Vale said nothing. His expression had gone through several phases in the last 30 seconds and had landed somewhere that looked like a man recalculating. Evelyn looked at Caleb. It was a direct look, the kind she gave when she was actually paying attention rather than managing a situation. "You knew it wasn't a legacy cable," she said. It wasn't a question. "The routing gauge was wrong," Caleb said. "And the insulation type. I've been through this room enough times to know what belongs here." She held his gaze for a moment, then she turned to Renata. "How long to map it fully?" 4 hours minimum. I'll need access to the full security network documentation." "You have it. Whatever you need." Evelyn turned to Vale. "Push the evening briefing, and get Holloway on the phone. We need federal liaison notified tonight." Vale started to say something. She looked at him, just looked, and whatever he'd been about to say didn't make it out. Caleb stayed late. Not because anyone asked him to. Gary had actually told him twice that he could go home, that the Carrington team had it from here, that he'd done his part. But there was something about leaving a thing in the middle that Caleb had never been comfortable with, and the symbol on the device was still sitting at the back of his mind, pressing upward, and he didn't want to be in his apartment tonight staring at the ceiling while it kept pressing. He was in the utility corridor adjacent to the security hub, doing legitimate maintenance work on a network cable tray that had developed a stress fracture along its mounting bracket. This was a real problem that had nothing to do with anything. It just needed fixing. When Renata found him at 6:45. "You're still here," she said. "Cable tray," he said, indicating the bracket. She looked at it. "That's not why you're still here." He didn't argue with that. "Did you finish the trace?" She leaned against the wall and crossed her arms. She was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone deciding how much to say. "The device routes through the security backbone and connects to every major system in the building. Doors, cameras, HVAC controls, the emergency intercom. If it goes active, whoever is running it can essentially take over the building's operational systems remotely." "Shut everything down," Caleb said, "or selectively control it, lock certain doors, cut feeds to specific cameras, create a contained situation inside a secured environment with no easy exit and compromised communications." Caleb thought about that for a moment. 340 federal personnel, senior officials from 12 agencies, 2 sitting senators, and the President of the United States. In a building where every exit could be locked from a remote terminal and every camera could be blinded at the same moment. "The symbol on the casing," he said. "The compass rose. Did you find anything on it?" Renata looked at him carefully. "You recognized it." "I don't know yet. I know I've seen it before. I can't place it." "Where would you have seen something like that?" He was quiet for a moment. The corridor hummed around them. Somewhere above them, the ventilation system cycled through its evening calibration, a low mechanical sound he'd learned to hear without registering. "A long time ago," he said, "in a different life." She studied him. She was good at studying people. She had the specific quality of attention that came from professional training in reading a room, and he could feel her doing it, cataloging him, revising whatever estimate she'd started with. "You were military," she said. He didn't confirm or deny it. He picked up his tool bag. "Tell Evelyn Carrington that the device didn't get into this building by itself," he said. "Someone with access installed it, which means the security breach isn't just in the hardware." Renata didn't say anything. "It's in the personnel list," Caleb said. He clocked out at 7:05 and drove home. Tessa was already asleep when he got there. Mrs. Aldridge had fed her and done the homework and reported that Tessa had eaten 2 full servings of rice and had opinions about the fairness of a spelling test she'd had that afternoon that Mrs. Aldridge had found both amusing and logistically challenging to navigate. Caleb thanked her, walked her out, and stood in the hallway of the apartment for a moment with his hand on the doorframe of Tessa's room. She was sleeping on her side with one arm thrown over the edge of the mattress and her mouth slightly open. Her backpack was in the corner, partially unzipped, with what looked like a library book half falling out of it. Her shoes were side by side near the door, left over right, which was how she always put them. He looked at her for a while. Then he went to the kitchen and made himself a cup of coffee he probably didn't need and sat at the table with his phone and his photographs and the specific, exhausting work of trying to remember. The symbol. The broken compass rose. He'd been turning it over all day, reaching for the memory the way you reach for something in the dark. Carefully, because you don't know what you'll touch. He closed his eyes. 14 years was a long time. The places that memory lived in weren't always organized the way you'd want them to be. Some things were clear. The sound of Mason's voice over comms, low and unhurried even when everything was falling apart. The weight of moving through unfamiliar terrain at night. The specific quality of the silence after the last gunshot. Other things had blurred at the edges, worn smooth by time and by the deliberate effort not to look at them too directly. But the symbol. He was halfway through his coffee when it surfaced. Not the symbol itself, not the full memory of where he'd seen it, but the outline of it. The shape of the context. A briefing room, classified materials. The specific weight of being told that certain things in certain documents were not to be retained, not to be discussed, not to be carried out of that room in any form. Operation North Star. He hadn't said that name out loud in over a decade. He set down his coffee cup. His hand was steady. He'd trained too long for his hands to do anything else, but something in his chest was doing something complicated. A tightening that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite fear and didn't have a clean name. If that symbol was connected to North Star, then whatever was inside that device wasn't a corporate espionage play. It wasn't someone trying to steal conference data or embarrass a federal agency. It was something older and more deliberate, something that had been planned by people who knew exactly what they were doing and had the knowledge and access to do it inside a building that was supposed to be one of the most secured civilian facilities in the country. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Around midnight, he heard Tessa shift in her room, the small sounds of a child resettling in sleep. He waited until the apartment was quiet again, then he went to the window and stood there looking at the street below, where a yellow streetlight threw an oval of light onto the wet pavement, and a cat was making its way along the base of the building with the total self-possession of something that had no awareness of being watched. He thought about Mason, not about the mission, not yet. He wasn't ready to go into that tonight, just about Mason specifically. The way he used to eat cereal standing up because sitting down to breakfast struck him as a waste of the morning. The particular way he laughed, which was mostly a sound through his nose, like he'd been surprised into it. The last time Caleb had seen his face, which was in the dark, before things went the way things went, and Mason had pressed the ring into Caleb's hand and said 4 words that Caleb had carried every day since. "Keep living, little brother." He turned the ring on his finger without thinking about it. He'd been doing that for 14 years. He went to bed. He didn't sleep well, but he slept, and in the morning he got up and made triangular sandwiches and got Tessa ready for school and kissed the top of her head when she climbed out of the car, and she turned around halfway up the school steps to wave at him, which she did every morning without fail, and he waited until she was through the door before he put the car in drive. The conference center was different again today, quieter in a specific way. The chaos of setup was mostly done, and what replaced it was the pressurized stillness of a thing about to happen. Security personnel who hadn't been visible yesterday were visible now, stationed at intervals along the main corridors, earpieces in, hands loose at their sides. The advance team from the Federal Protective Service had been doing sweeps since 5 in the morning, according to Hector at the loading dock, who had watched them go through with the resigned familiarity of a man who had seen this many times and had made his peace with the early mornings it required. Caleb badged in and went to the security coordination room. Renata was there. Evelyn Carrington was there. Two people Caleb didn't recognize who had the bearing of federal liaisons and the expressions of people who had been awake since before 5. Gary was in the corner with his coffee, occupying as little space as possible, which was Gary's preferred strategy when rooms got complicated. Preston Vale was not there. Caleb noted this without comment. "We've identified the device's full routing," Renata said when Caleb came in, without preamble, as if he'd been expected. Maybe he had. "It doesn't just connect to the security backbone. It has a secondary connection we almost missed, a very low-footprint channel running to the building's emergency broadcast system. So it can lock the doors and cut the cameras," Caleb said, "and also take over the intercom and broadcast whatever it's programmed to broadcast, or allow remote audio transmission. We don't know which without activating it, and we're not activating it." One of the federal liaisons, a woman named Ashford, she'd introduced herself when Caleb walked in, which meant someone had told her to expect him, said, "We're recommending the conference be postponed pending a full security audit." "The president doesn't postpone," Evelyn said. That's not how this works. Postponing sends a message. Proceeding with a compromised security system sends a different message," Ashford said. "We have the device identified and isolated," Evelyn said. "Renata, can we physically disable it without triggering whatever activation protocol it might have?" Renata's expression was the careful look of someone who wanted to say yes, and was not sure she could say yes honestly. Possibly. The risk is if it has a tamper response built in, and a device this sophisticated, installed this carefully, probably does. "So we leave it in place," Caleb said. Everyone looked at him. "If you pull it and it has a tamper trigger, you might activate the very thing you're trying to prevent. If you leave it in place, it stays in passive mode until whoever installed it sends the activation signal." He paused. "Which means the threat isn't gone. It's waiting. And the person who put it there is still somewhere in the loop." The room was quiet. "The personnel breach," Evelyn said. She was looking at Caleb with the expression she'd had in the mechanical room, the one that meant she was recalibrating. "You said last night that someone with access installed it. You meant someone on our side." "I meant someone who had building access and security clearance and enough knowledge of the infrastructure layout to hide the device where they hid it, which narrows it considerably." Ashford said, "We're pulling the full access log for the past 90 days. "Pull the last 6 months," Caleb said. "The cable routing, the mount hardware, the insulation type. That device wasn't installed recently. It's been there at minimum 3 months, probably longer." Ashford wrote something down. She didn't question the estimate. Caleb noticed that she didn't question it, and noted what that meant about how she'd been briefed about him. Evelyn said, "Can you give us anything else about the symbol?" The room shifted slightly. This was new information for most of the people in it. Renata looked at the table. Caleb understood that Renata had briefed Evelyn on their conversation last night, which was appropriate and which he didn't resent. "It's a connection I'm working on," he said. "I need a little more time." "We have about 9 hours," Evelyn said. "I know." She studied him. He'd noticed that she did this. Studied people, not aggressively, but with the patient attention of someone who believed that most of what a person was going to tell you was visible before they opened their mouth. He'd worked with people like that before. He respected it more than he usually admitted. "What do you need?" she said. "Access to the building's full contractor access log," he said, "and a quiet hour." She looked at Gary. Gary nodded, already typing. "You have it," she said. Caleb sat down at the table and started going through the logs, and the morning moved around him, and the conference center filled slowly with the sounds of something enormous and complicated about to begin. And somewhere in the building, in a conduit behind a cooling unit in the east mechanical room, a small black device waited in the dark for a signal that only one person knew how to send. The contractor access logs went back 8 months. Caleb worked through them the way he worked through everything, methodically, without rushing, starting at the oldest entries and moving forward. Gary had pulled the full records, every badge swipe, every visitor authorization, every temporary access credential issued for maintenance or construction or technical work in the building since the previous spring. It was a long list. Jefferson Federal hosted enough events that its contractor roster turned over constantly, and the access management system had the particular bureaucratic quality of something designed by people who cared deeply about logging everything and not at all about making the logs useful to read. He was an hour in when he found the first anomaly. A contractor credential issued under the name Harwick Systems LLC, authorized for infrastructure maintenance in the East Wing, active for a 3-week window 7 months ago. Standard enough. Except that when he cross-referenced the credential against the visitor log, the physical sign-in record showed only 2 visits, but the badge swipe data showed 11 separate access events, 9 of which occurred outside of normal contractor hours, between 11 at night and 4 in the morning. He flagged it and kept going. 40 minutes later, he found a second one. Different company name, Meridian Technical Services. Different time window, different access area listed on the authorization. But the same pattern, more badge events than visitor records, access times that didn't line up with any declared work schedule. And one of the access events, he noted with the particular stillness of someone touching something sharp, occurred in the East Mechanical Room. He brought both findings to Ashford. She looked at them for a long time. Harwick Systems and Meridian Technical Services, she said. I ran both names through the state contractor registry this morning, Caleb said. Harwick has a registration, but the address on file is a mail forwarding service in Delaware. Meridian doesn't appear in the registry at all. Ashford looked at him with the expression of someone who had revised their estimate of a person twice in the same morning and wasn't sure where to land. You did this before you came in today. I did it at about 1 in the morning, he said. I couldn't sleep. She turned to her colleague, a man named Pruitt, who had said almost nothing all morning but who had the quality of attention of someone absorbing everything, and said, run both names through the full federal contractor database and cross-reference against known shell entity patterns. Pruitt left the room. Evelyn was standing near the window on the far side of the coordination room on a call she'd been conducting in a low voice for the last 20 minutes. When she ended it, she came to the table and looked at what Caleb had found. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, Preston brought Meridian in. Caleb looked at her. Not directly, she said, and her voice had the careful quality of someone working through something they didn't want to be true. He authorized the technical services contract. I approved the overall contractor roster, but individual authorizations at that level went through him. I didn't review every credential issuance. Do you know where Vale is this morning? Ashford said. He called in with a conflict, Evelyn said. He's not on site today. The room was quiet for a moment. That's not confirmation of anything, Caleb said, because it wasn't, and because he'd learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you could do in a situation like this was let a plausible theory become a certainty before you'd earned the certainty. He might have a legitimate conflict. The access pattern could have happened without his knowledge. You don't believe that, Evelyn said. I believe in not acting on assumptions before I have to, Caleb said. There's time to establish it properly. She looked at him. How much time? He checked the wall clock. 8:47. The conference was scheduled to open at 10. The president's arrival was at 10:20. About an hour and a half, he said. The symbol had been bothering him all morning in the way that unresolved things bothered him. Not loudly, but persistently, the way a small stone in a boot bothers you. You can walk on it, you can function, but it's there with every step. He'd been thinking about it wrong, he realized. He'd been trying to remember where he'd seen the symbol, when what he should have been asking was what the symbol meant to the people who used it. He excused himself from the coordination room and went to the East Mechanical Room alone. He needed to see it again. The device was where it had always been, in the conduit behind the cooling unit, sitting in its adhesive mounts with the professional stillness of something that had been designed for exactly this kind of waiting. Caleb crouched down and shone his flashlight on the casing and looked at the symbol in the lower left corner. Broken compass rose. That was what he'd called it last night, and it was accurate as a description, but it wasn't complete. Looking at it now, more carefully, he saw that the lines weren't random. They were specifically arranged at 4 directional points, but the north point was severed, broken off at the base. The remaining 3 points were intact. A compass without north. He sat back on his heels. A unit that operated without official direction, without a sanctioned heading, a team that functioned outside the normal command structure. Operation North Star. The memory hit him not as a single image, but as a sequence. The briefing room, the classified documents, the specific weight of what they'd been told before the mission. They were going in without official acknowledgement. If something went wrong, there would be no rescue and no record. The symbol on the briefing materials, which he'd seen for approximately 45 seconds before the documents were collected, had been exactly this. A compass without north. A symbol for an operation that had no official direction because it officially didn't exist. He stood up slowly. Someone in this building, connected to whatever was going to happen today, knew about North Star. Knew about it specifically enough to mark the device with its symbol, which meant this wasn't random. This wasn't corporate espionage or a disgruntled contractor or opportunistic exploitation of a security gap. This was targeted. This was about the conference specifically because of who was going to be in it. The president, Jonathan Hale, who had been a young senator 14 years ago in a dangerous situation overseas and who had been brought home because 4 Navy SEALs had gone in without orders and without acknowledgement and without any guarantee that anyone would know their names if they didn't come back. One of them hadn't. Caleb left the mechanical room and walked Fachi Wos. He found Ashford in the corridor outside the coordination room and pulled her aside. The symbol is a marker for a classified operation from 14 years ago, he said, keeping his voice low. An operation that involved the president, when he was still a senator. I was part of the team that ran it. Ashford went very still. What operation? It was called North Star. It was a rescue mission, unsanctioned, conducted by a 4-man SEAL team. The people who know it happened are a very short list. The people who would use its symbol to mark a device designed to compromise a building the president is walking into. He stopped. This isn't about the conference, it's about him specifically. You're certain about the symbol. I'm certain I've seen it in one context in my life, and that context was North Star. Ashford looked at him for a long moment. He could see her working through it, the same way he'd worked through it in the mechanical room. The discomfort of a thing that made sense in a way you didn't want it to make sense. I need to make a call, she said. Make it fast, Caleb said. She already had her phone out. He went back to the coordination room. Renata was at the monitoring station, running something on the security system's diagnostic interface. Evelyn was on another call near the window. Gary had apparently given up on being present for any of this and retreated to the operations office, which was probably the right call. Caleb sat down and looked at the access log again. There was a third anomaly. He'd almost missed it because it was older than the others. 11 months ago, a single access event, not a pattern. A contractor credential under a name he hadn't seen before. Sloan Infrastructure Consulting. Sloan. He looked at the name on the screen for several seconds without moving. Derek Sloan had been the 4th man on the North Star team. He'd been the communications specialist, 2 years older than Caleb, with a particular talent for electronic systems and a quality of personality that Caleb had always found slightly off. Not wrong exactly, but slightly misaligned, like something that was calibrated a degree or two from where it should have been. He'd separated from the teams 2 years after North Star. Caleb hadn't heard his name since. His hands were steady on the keyboard, but something in his chest was doing the thing again, the tightening without a clean name. Derek had been in this building 11 months ago, under a company name that used his own last name, which was either arrogance or carelessness or something else. A message, maybe, for anyone who knew where to look. Caleb printed the record and folded it, and put it in his shirt pocket and didn't say anything to anyone yet. The main hall began filling at 9:30. From where Caleb stood at the back of the room, he'd been positioned there by a federal security agent who had very politely explained that his presence near the front of the hall during the arrival sequence was not going to work, and Caleb had not argued because arguing was not going to change the geometry of the situation. He could see the full scope of what had been assembled. Rows of chairs arranged in precise arcs, clusters of people in the particular configurations that power produced. The denser the cluster, the more important the individual at its center. Senior officials from the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, 2 cabinet secretaries he recognized from photographs, a senator he'd seen on television. At the tables near the front, the Carrington Strategic Systems executives occupied a section that had a specific quality of self-satisfaction, the look of people who had been responsible for securing all of this and were pleased with themselves for it. Preston Vale was not among them. His chair was empty. Caleb noted the empty chair. He also noted, from his position at the back of the room, where the exits were, which security personnel were stationed at which points, and how many of the overhead cameras were in the coverage pattern he'd memorized from the security hub layout. He wasn't doing this deliberately. It was simply what his eyes did in a room. They mapped it. They identified the variables. Years of practice had made it involuntary in the way that breathing was involuntary. At 9:50, Evelyn appeared at his elbow. "Ashford made her call," she said quietly. "They're aware of the North Star connection. They're not postponing." "I didn't expect them to." She said, Evelyn paused. She said the president was briefed. About the device? About the symbol? About you? Caleb looked at her. About me specifically. About the fact that someone who was part of the original operation identified the symbol. She was looking at the front of the room when she said this, not at him. She didn't say anything else about that. He turned that over. The president had been briefed that a man who had been on the North Star team was here, in this building, standing at the back of the room that the president was about to walk into. He tried to imagine what Jonathan Hale had done with that information, whether he'd filed it somewhere in his mind and moved on, or whether it had landed the way Caleb suspected it might land for a man who had never been able to publicly acknowledge what had been done for him 14 years ago. He didn't know. He had no way of knowing. He turned his attention back to the room. "Vale's seat is empty," he said. "I know." Evelyn's voice was controlled, but there was something under it. "I've been trying to reach him since 7 this morning. His assistant says he's not responding." "I found a third contractor anomaly," Caleb said. He took the folded printout from his shirt pocket and held it toward her without looking at her. She took it. "The name on the credential is someone I knew from a long time ago, someone who was on the same operation I mentioned to Ashford." She unfolded it and read it. He heard the small pause in her breathing. "Derek Sloan. He was our communications specialist 14 years ago." Caleb kept his voice even. "Electronic systems. Infrastructure. He would know exactly how to install a device like the one in the mechanical room without leaving the kind of trace that a standard sweep would catch. And he had access to this building 11 months ago, under a company name using his own surname, which makes me think he either didn't care if someone found it or he wanted someone specific to find it." He paused. "I don't know which yet." Evelyn refolded the printout and held it against her palm. She was quiet for a moment in a way that wasn't uncertainty. It was the specific quiet of someone who had already decided what to do and was taking a breath before doing it. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When you came to me that first day with the cable, I dismissed it. Not because I thought you were wrong. I dismissed it because Vale had already told me the preliminary assessment was clean, and because—" She stopped, started again. "Because you were the maintenance tech. Because it was easier to trust the report than to listen to the person who had actually been in the room." She glanced at him. "I owe you an apology for that." Caleb thought about the ring, about the conversation in the security coordination room 2 days ago, about the particular quality of being looked through. "You listened eventually," he said. "Not fast enough." "No," he agreed. "Not fast enough. But you did." She was quiet again. Then, "Why didn't you push harder? When Vale shut you down publicly, why didn't you escalate it further?" It was a real question. He considered it honestly. "Because I've been in situations where the person raising the alarm doesn't have the right credentials, and the people with the credentials have already decided what the answer is. Pushing harder doesn't usually work. Finding a different angle does. The angle being staying in the building, keeping watch, and running your own investigation on your own time. Something like that." She looked at him then, directly, and he let her look. "The ring," she said. "Your brother." "Yeah. I'm sorry for asking you to take it off." "You didn't know." "That doesn't make it better." He didn't argue with that either. The room shifted around them. A new energy, a change in the quality of attention, the particular realignment of a crowd when something is about to happen. Near the main entrance, the Federal Protective Service agents were moving into their prepared positions. Someone at the front of the room said something into an earpiece and straightened. "He's 2 minutes out," Caleb said, reading the room. Evelyn nodded and moved toward the front. Caleb stayed where he was. The doors opened at 10:19. Jonathan Hale walked in the way powerful people walk into rooms, not performing it, not thinking about it, just moving forward with the particular ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times and had stopped noticing the weight of it. He was taller than he looked in photographs, with the kind of face that aged in a way that looked like experience rather than just time. He shook hands at the perimeter without breaking stride. The receiving line worked its way toward him as he moved, a practiced choreography. Caleb watched from the back of the room. He wasn't looking for recognition. He hadn't been looking for it. He was looking at the exits, at the camera positions, at the crowd for anyone whose body language was slightly wrong. The micro-tension of someone waiting for something. The specific quality of stillness that wasn't calm but preparation. He didn't find it, which didn't mean it wasn't there. It meant he hadn't found it yet. The president was moving down the reception line, and Caleb was running the geometry of the room in his head. If the device activated now, which doors would lock, which cameras would go blind, how the crowd would move, where the choke points were. When he became aware that the movement at the front of the room had stopped, he looked up. Jonathan Hale had stopped moving. He was standing approximately 15 feet from the front row, and he had turned, not toward the receiving line, not toward the Carrington executives, not toward any of the federal officials who were waiting with the particular patient readiness of people who expected to be acknowledged. He had turned toward the back of the room, toward Caleb. The distance between them was the full length of the conference hall. The room was full of people. There was no logical reason that the President of the United States, entering a secured event surrounded by his protective detail, should be looking at a maintenance technician standing at the back wall with a work radio clipped to his belt. But he was. Caleb didn't move. He watched the president look at him, and then look at his hand, and then look at him again. And he watched something move across Jonathan Hale's face. Not performed emotion, not the public expression of a man who understood cameras were on him, but the private thing underneath that, the kind of recognition that can't be staged because it happens before the brain catches up to the heart. He was looking at the ring. The Compass Rose ring, worn smooth, on the right hand of a man in maintenance clothes standing alone at the back of a grand hall full of senators and generals and executives who had spent the last 2 days looking through him. Hale said something quietly to the agent at his shoulder. The agent's expression shifted. Not alarm, just a micro-adjustment, a recalibration of the immediate plan. The president turned fully away from the receiving line and began walking toward the back of the room. The crowd noticed. Not all at once. It was a ripple effect, the way attention moves in a room when a focal point suddenly shifts. The executives at the front tables noticed first, then the people in the rows nearest the aisle, then the outer sections. A wave of quiet confusion moving through the assembled federal officials and security personnel and conference guests as the President of the United States walked past all of them without stopping. Caleb heard someone say, low and tight, near the front, "What is he?" He heard someone else say, "Who is that?" He stood still. Hale stopped in front of him. Up close, the years were more visible. Not badly, not in a way that diminished anything, just in the way that time marks a person who has been through things. His eyes were steady and very clear, and they were fixed on Caleb's face with an expression that was complicated in the specific way that a debt carried a long time becomes complicated. He looked down at the ring. Then he reached out and took Caleb's right hand in both of his, the way you hold a hand when you're trying to say something that words aren't quite going to cover, and the room went completely, absolutely silent. "I know who you are," Hale said. His voice was not loud. He wasn't performing this. "I've known who you are for 14 years. Caleb said nothing. "I've been told, repeatedly, that there was no way to—" Hale stopped. He looked like a man working against something that had been waiting a long time to be said. "The operation was classified. The records were sealed. I was told the men who came in for me couldn't be publicly acknowledged without compromising, but—" He stopped again. "I'm sorry. I've wanted to say that to someone for a very long time, and I'm saying it badly. You don't have to say anything, Caleb said. I know I don't have to. Hale's voice was quiet and direct. I want to. Your brother? Sir? Caleb's voice came out even, but it cost something. Not here. Hale looked at him. He understood. Caleb could see it. He was a man who knew how to read a room, and he could see what public acknowledgement in this moment, in front of these cameras and these people, would cost someone who had spent 14 years being careful about exactly that. He nodded once, minimal. But he didn't let go of Caleb's hand. He turned, slowly, deliberately, so that he was facing the room. The full room. Every senior official and executive and security consultant and camera. I want to make something clear, he said, and his voice carried now, filled the hall the way a room like this was designed to carry a voice, and every person in it went still. The man standing next to me is not a maintenance technician. He is a decorated special operations veteran who served this country with the distinction that this country was not permitted to publicly acknowledge. He paused. That ends today. The room was so quiet that Caleb could hear his own breathing. He was aware of Evelyn Carrington near the front of the room, and the particular look on her face, not guilt exactly, something more complicated than guilt, the specific expression of a person watching something fall into place that they had been looking at wrong for days. He was aware of the Carrington executives, some of whom had the expressions of people who were rapidly reassessing several recent decisions. He was aware of the federal agents repositioning slightly, not because of any threat, but because the geometry of the room had changed and they were adjusting to it. He was aware of Preston Vale's empty chair. And then, underneath all of that awareness, underneath the weight of the room and the president's grip on his hand and the silence pressing in from every direction, underneath all of it, he was aware of the ring on his finger and what it weighed and what it had always weighed and the 4 words it had carried for 14 years. Keep living, little brother. He stood straight. He didn't speak. There was nothing he needed to say in this room, to these people, in this moment. What had been said had been said. What had been hidden had been uncovered. He was not a man who needed a room full of powerful people to tell him what he was worth, and he was not going to start being that man now. But he stood straight. And then, from somewhere near the northeast corner of the room, a sound came through the building's intercom system that was not a sound the intercom system was supposed to make. It was a tone, low, sustained, cycling. And then a voice, filtered, digitally masked, unidentifiable, said 4 words through every speaker in the building simultaneously. North Star, authorization code, active. Every door in the conference hall locked at the same moment. The lights in the main hall dropped to emergency level, casting everything in the specific yellow-gray of a system switching to backup power. 3 of the 6 visible security cameras rotated on their mounts. Not because anyone had directed them to, but because a device in an East Mechanical Room conduit had just received the signal it had been waiting months to receive, and it was doing exactly what it had been built to do. In the stunned half-second that followed, before the room found its voice, before the protective detail moved, before the crowd's confusion crossed over into fear, Caleb Danner let go of the president's hand. Stay with your detail, he said. Don't move toward any exterior door. Then he was already moving. He moved through the crowd the way water moves through a gap. Not forcing it, reading the space and finding the line of least resistance, slipping past the first wave of confused movement before it had fully organized itself into panic. The room behind him was loud now, not screaming, not yet, but the particular rising volume of several hundred people who had just had their sense of safety removed and were still processing what that meant. He heard the protective detail issuing commands, controlled, practiced, the specific cadence of people executing a plan they'd rehearsed, and he heard the crowd's confusion sharpening into something edgier as the locked doors registered and the emergency lighting held its flat yellow gray, and nobody came on the intercom to tell them what was happening because the intercom was no longer theirs to use. He got to the side corridor in 12 seconds. The door to the corridor was mechanical, not on the electronic lock system, which was why he'd noted it 2 days ago when he was running the geometry of what the device could and couldn't control. He pushed through it and let it close behind him, and the noise of the main hall dropped immediately, replaced by the building's ambient sounds, the hum and breath of the infrastructure he'd spent 3 years learning. His radio crackled, Gary's voice, higher than usual. Caleb, what is happening? The security panel just... Gary, listen to me. I need you to physically cut power to the East Mechanical Room's secondary data panel. Not the main panel, the secondary. The breaker's in the utility substation on the north side of the building. It's a gray box, third row from the top, labeled EMR2. Cut the power? If I cut the power the whole east wing, the device runs off the building grid through that secondary panel. If we cut it, we isolate it. It might not shut down what's already been activated, but it'll stop it from receiving further commands. He was moving while he talked, heading east along the corridor, his boots quiet on the floor. Can you get to the utility substation? A pause. He could hear Gary breathing, could hear him working through it, the same calculation Gary always made when Caleb told him something needed doing that Gary wasn't sure about. The weighing of his own instincts against the evidence that Caleb's instincts tended to be right. Yeah, Gary said, I can get there. Go now. Don't wait for anyone to tell you it's okay. He clicked off and kept moving. The east corridor was empty. Everyone who'd been in this part of the building had either been in the main hall or had heard something wrong and made the reasonable decision to stay where they were. Caleb passed 3 locked doors. The electronic locks had engaged exactly as the device was designed to make them engage, which confirmed that the tamper response he'd been afraid of had not triggered, which meant the device was functioning as intended rather than malfunctioning, which was in some ways worse and in other ways better because a functioning device was predictable. He reached the junction outside the security coordination room and stopped. Renata was there. She was at the monitoring station inside, and she had the look of someone who had been running fast calculations for the last 90 seconds and had arrived at several conclusions she didn't like. When she saw Caleb in the doorway, she said, "The device went active at 10:22. It's broadcasting on a frequency I didn't scan for because the hardware profile suggested it was a different type of unit than it actually is." It's broadcasting to what? That's what I'm trying to determine. The signal is going out, but I can't identify the receiver without more time. She turned back to the screen. The door locks are the bigger immediate problem. The building's emergency protocol is supposed to default to unlocked in a power event, but the device has overridden the protocol. I can manually release individual doors from here, but the interface is slow. It's one at a time, and there are 43 locked doors in the current system. Which doors do we need? The main hall has 4 exits. 2 are on the north wall, 2 on the south. The north exits open onto the parking structure, and the south exits open onto the main plaza. I'd start with the south exits. The parking structure has a lower ceiling, and if there's a crowd surge in that space, start with the south, Caleb said. Work fast. I'm working fast, she said, not defensively, just stating a fact. He looked at the monitoring feeds. Half the camera positions had gone dark. The device had rotated them away from their coverage zones, and the feeds were showing ceiling angles or walls or empty corridors. But 4 cameras were still live, including the one covering the main hall, and on that feed he could see the crowd in a dense cluster near the center of the room, the protective detail forming a perimeter around the president's position. The general controlled chaos of a room full of people who were frightened and well-dressed and being managed by professionals who were doing their jobs. He scanned the feed for the Carrington executive section. The table was visible in the upper right of the frame. Most of the people who'd been sitting there were now standing, clustered together the way people cluster when they don't know what else to do. Preston Vale's chair was still empty. I need to get to the mechanical room, Caleb said. Renata looked at him. The device might have a physical failsafe. If someone tries to access it while it's active, I know, stay on the doors. He left the coordination room and moved toward the east mechanical room, and thought about Derek Sloan while he moved. Bog, 11 months ago. A single access event under a company name that used his own surname. Caleb had been turning that over since he found it in the log, and the more he turned it, the more it felt like something intentional rather than careless. Derek had always been precise. He'd been the kind of person who didn't do things accidentally. Every choice was a calculation, and if he'd registered a contractor credential under the name Sloan Infrastructure Consulting and walked into this building and installed the foundation of something that would activate 14 months later, he had done it knowing someone might eventually find it. Knowing that the someone most likely to find it, if they were paying attention, was Caleb. which meant either Derek wanted to be found or Derek wanted Caleb specifically to be the one looking. He didn't know which. He wasn't sure it mattered right now. What mattered was the device and the building and the 340 people in the main hall who needed the doors to open. He reached the east mechanical room and pushed the door open. The room was darker than usual, the overhead fluorescence off because the secondary panel was, he checked his watch. Gary should have reached the utility substation by now, should be at the EMR2 breaker. As if in confirmation, the faint amber glow from the device's status indicator in the conduit, which he could see from the doorway, flickered once and went dark. The secondary panel was cut. He exhaled once, not in relief exactly, but in the specific release of tension that comes when a thing you planned actually works. His radio. "Done," Gary said, and his voice was steadier now. The particular steadiness of someone who has acted in an unclear situation and found that acting helped. "The EMR2 is cut. What do I do now?" "Where are you?" "Utility substation, north side." "Stay there. Don't let anyone near that breaker box." "Not anyone." "Copy," Gary said, and Caleb could hear that Gary had also registered the weight of that instruction, the implication that the person he might need to stop could be someone with access and authority, and that Gary was going to hold that line anyway. He crouched in front of the conduit and shone his flashlight in. The device was dark. Status indicator off, no heat signature from the casing, the cable connecting it to the secondary data port now inert. He didn't touch it, forensic value, and also the residual concern about tamper response even in a powered-down state. But he looked at it for a moment, this small black box that had sat in this conduit for the better part of a year and had come within a very short window of doing what it was designed to do. He thought about who had put it here. Then his phone buzzed. Not his radio, his personal phone in his left pocket. He pulled it out. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer it. Then something, instinct, the specific feeling of a thing that needed to happen even if you didn't want it to, made him pick up. "I wondered if you'd find the access log," Derek Sloan said. His voice was the same. 14 years and it was exactly the same. The flat Midwestern vowels, the particular quality of calm that Caleb had never been able to decide was genuine or performed. He'd grown up in Indiana and he sounded like it, and he'd never tried to sound like anything else. Caleb stood up in the mechanical room and kept his voice even. "Where are you?" "Somewhere you won't find me in the next 10 minutes, which is all we need to talk." "The device is offline, Derek." A pause. Not a surprised pause. More like someone recalculating the remaining moves. "You cut the secondary panel." 30 seconds ago. That's faster than I expected. There was something in his voice that might have been respect, or might have been something else. "You always were faster than the situation called for." "What is this?" Caleb said. "What is this actually about?" "You know what it's about." "Tell me anyway." Another pause, longer. When Derek spoke again, the flatness in his voice had something under it, something that had been sitting there for a long time. "Wainwright was going to walk away clean, Sterling Wainwright. You know that name?" Caleb knew the name. He'd seen it in the Carrington executive roster, a senior figure in the company's government contracts division, a name that had come up twice in the contractor authorization trail he'd been following. "He's connected to Carrington. He's connected to a lot of things, including the reason North Star was classified the way it was classified." Derek's voice stayed flat, but the thing under it was more audible now. "You and I both know Mason didn't have to die on that mission. The intelligence we were given about the extraction route was wrong. Not accidentally wrong, deliberately wrong. And the person who sourced that intelligence, who passed it through a chain that nobody was supposed to trace, was Wainwright." The mechanical room was very quiet. "He was working private security contracts then," Derek said. "Had a relationship with a foreign interest group that benefited from the mission failing. Mason died because of bad intel that someone was paid to make bad." A beat. "I've known this for 6 years. I've had it documented for 4. And every official channel I tried, you tried official channels. Don't say it like that." "I'm not saying it like anything. I'm asking. I tried. 3 times. 3 different agencies. Each time the classification wall came down and the file disappeared and I got a visit from someone in an unmarked vehicle who suggested I think carefully about what I was doing. His voice was still flat, but there was something breaking at the edges of it now, something that had been held flat for a very long time and was starting to show the cost. So I built something that couldn't be disappeared, a situation that would force it into the open, force Wainwright into the same room as the one person who could hold him publicly accountable. The president. The man Mason died getting home. Derek's voice was quieter now. I wasn't going to hurt anyone, Caleb. The device, it was a containment mechanism. Force the room into lockdown. Broadcast the documentation I've been sitting on for 4 years through the building's intercom. Make it impossible for anyone in that room to pretend they hadn't heard it. Caleb absorbed this. You used the North Star symbol, he said. I used it so you'd find it. Another pause. I knew you were in that building. I'd been tracking the access logs for months. When I saw your badge in the maintenance system, He stopped. I needed someone in there who would understand what they were looking at, who wouldn't let it get buried again. You could have called me. I didn't think you'd believe me. You didn't think I'd believe you, Caleb said, and heard the flatness in his own voice, the specific sound of someone holding something painful at arm's length. After 14 years, I thought you'd moved on, Derek said. I thought you'd built something and you were protecting it and you wouldn't want to go back into this, and I didn't want to put that on you without... He stopped again. I made choices I can't fully justify. I know that. Caleb thought about Mason, about bad intelligence and an extraction route that someone had been paid to make wrong, about 14 years of a silver ring and a promise and the particular weight of grief that doesn't have anyone to hold accountable because the thing that caused it was buried under a classification wall. The documentation, he said. Where is it? It's on a secure server. I can give you the access credentials. Give them to Ashford, Federal Liaison. She's in the building. He thought for a moment. And Derek, turn yourself in. Silence. Whatever you built in this building, however good the reason was, it terrorized 300 people and it endangered the president. You need to own that. He paused. The rest of it, the documentation, Wainwright, what happened to Mason, that needs to come out through a process that can actually hold, not a stunt. A very long pause. I know, Derek said finally. It was the voice of someone who had probably known for a while and had decided the alternative was worse than knowing. I know. The line went quiet for a moment. Then, the ring, you still have it. Caleb looked at his hand. Yeah. He would have, Derek's voice caught, just once, just briefly. He would have said this was exactly the kind of overcomplicated mess you always got yourself into. Despite everything, despite the weight of the last 48 hours and the locked doors and the president and the room full of people who needed those doors open, Caleb felt something move through him that was the closest thing to a smile he'd been capable of in a very long time. He would have said that, he said. The line went dead. Tim, he went back to work. That was the only way to describe what happened in the next hour and 40 minutes. Not heroically, not smoothly, just the grinding, methodical, often frustrating work of reversing what the device had done to the building before the secondary panel was cut. Renata had gotten 2 of the 4 south exits open by the time Caleb returned to the coordination room. He sat down next to her, and they worked through the remaining doors together, Renata on the interface and Caleb reading out the door IDs from the building schematic he had memorized well enough to recite from memory, which saved them enough time that by 11:15 all 43 locked doors in the building were manually released. The main hall exits opened to a wave of noise that carried all the way to the coordination room. Not panic. By the time the doors opened, the protective detail had the room managed well enough that what came through the exits was more relief than anything else. The particular release of several hundred people who had spent 45 minutes in a locked room and were now no longer in a locked room. Caleb heard it through the wall and felt something in his shoulders ease that he hadn't realized had been locked up. Ashford came into the coordination room at 11:22. Derek Sloan called me, she said. He gave me server credentials and a location. He's in a parking structure 3 blocks east. She looked at Caleb. He said you told him to call. I told him to turn himself in. Same result. She sat down. She looked like someone who had been running on adrenaline for 2 hours and could feel it starting to metabolize. The documentation he provided is substantial. I've had 2 people reviewing it for the last 20 minutes. She paused. The intelligence sourcing on North Star. If what Sloan has is what it appears to be, it'll hold, Caleb said. He didn't know that with certainty, but he believed it, which was as close as he could get right now. Ashford looked at him steadily. Sterling Waywright was escorted from the main hall 8 minutes ago. We had a federal marshal present. Another pause. He said it was a misunderstanding. Of course he did. People like that always do. She was quiet for a moment. Caleb, what happened in that room earlier? What the president said. I know. There are going to be questions. People are going to want statements, interviews, the full account of North Star from someone who was actually there. I know, he said again. How do you want to handle it? He thought about it. Genuinely thought about it. Not the reflex answer, but the actual one. He thought about Mason and about the other men from the team, 2 of whom were still alive and living ordinary lives in ordinary places, and about the question of what acknowledgement meant and who it was for and whether it changed anything that had already happened. He thought about Tessa, who would come home from school today and tell him about her spelling test and her sandwich triangles and would have no context for any of this and would not need any context for any of this for a long time. Through official channels, he said, properly. Whatever process exists for formally declassifying and acknowledging an operation, I want to do it right, not in front of cameras because a situation forced it. Ashford nodded slowly. That's a reasonable position. The other 2 surviving team members need to be contacted first, before anything is public. They deserve to know before it's news. We can do that. And the families of the men who didn't come back. Mason's, there's no one left. His parents are gone. But some of the others, he stopped. The families first, before any of it goes anywhere else. She wrote something down. I'll make that happen personally, she said. He believed her. Bats. Preston Vale was located at 2:17 in the afternoon at an airport 40 minutes from the city in the process of attempting to board a private charter flight to a destination that federal liaison personnel described in their report as non-extradition friendly. He was detained at the gate. He did not say much, according to the agents who processed him, which was a significant change from his usual behavior and which several people who had spent the last 3 days in his vicinity found quietly satisfying. Caleb learned this from Gary, who had learned it from a federal marshal who had stopped by the operations office for a cup of coffee and apparently felt like talking. Gary delivered the information with the specific expression of a man who had done something important today and was still figuring out how to carry that, the weight and the relief of it mixed together in a way that didn't fully resolve. The EMR 2-breaker, Caleb said. What about it? You got there fast. You didn't hesitate. Gary was quiet for a moment. He was looking at his coffee cup. You said go, so I went. He looked up. That's the job, isn't it? When someone who knows what they're talking about tells you something needs doing, you do it. Yeah, Caleb said. That's the job. Gary nodded, satisfied with this, and went back to the operations office. Evelyn found Caleb at 3:45 in the East Corridor, where he had returned to do what he had told Gary he would do and had not yet had time to do. Replace the worn gasket on the loading dock hydraulic door. It was still on his work order list. It still needed doing. The fact that the day had contained several events of significant magnitude did not change the fact that an unsealed hydraulic door gasket would cause problems if it rained. She stood in the corridor and watched him work for a moment without saying anything. The investigation into Waywright's connection to North Star, she said finally. What he did with the intelligence sourcing. If that's substantiated, it'll be substantiated. He didn't look up from the gasket. Some of that is going to land on Carrington. The contracts he was running, the authorizations he signed off on, some of those ran through my company's government division. Her voice was level, but not quite controlled. There was something under the level that was the sound of a person reckoning with something large. I signed off on things I didn't look at closely enough, in the interest of moving fast and trusting the people I'd put in place. That's different from what Waywright did, Caleb said. It's not nothing, though. He sat back and looked at her. She was standing with her arms at her sides, not crossed, which he'd noticed was what she did when she was being direct rather than managed. No, he said. It's not nothing, but it's also not what it is for him. There's going to be a full audit, federal and internal. I've already instructed our legal team to cooperate fully and not to protect anything that needs to be examined. She paused. It's going to be expensive, for the company and for my reputation. Probably. She looked at him. You're not going to tell me it'll be fine. I don't know if it'll be fine. I know it's the right call. He picked up the gasket tool again. For what it's worth, the way you handled the last 48 hours, when you finally had the information in front of you, you didn't try to protect the wrong things. That matters. She was quiet for a while. The position I mentioned, security advisor, reviewing our systems, our personnel protocols, the way we handle information from people in the field who identify problems. She looked at him steadily. I'd like to make that offer real, with actual authority, the kind where when a maintenance technician walks into a room and says something is wrong, someone at the decision-making level listens. Caleb thought about that. He thought about it honestly, which meant thinking about whether it was something he actually wanted rather than whether it was something he was supposed to want. He thought about what it would mean for Tessa's school schedule, and whether he was ready to do something that involved more exposure and more conversation and less time alone in mechanical rooms fixing things that needed fixing. He thought about Mason and about the idea of a job that meant the next person who raised an alarm in the right building at the right time actually got heard before it mattered instead of after. I'll think about it, he said. Genuinely think about it. Not tell you yes because the situation makes it feel like I should. Something in Evelyn's expression shifted, a slight release, like a tension she'd been holding that had just been given permission to ease. That's fair, she said. Take the time. She started to leave, then stopped. For what it's worth, she said, not turning around. You were right. From the beginning, you were right, and I let someone else's opinion override what I should have been able to see for myself. She paused. I'll be thinking about that for a while. Then she walked down the corridor and the sound of her heels on the polished floor faded and Caleb went back to the gasket. He finished at 4:50, logged the work order as completed, packed his tools methodically into the bag, checked the door seal, ran the hydraulic mechanism through one full cycle to confirm it was seated right. It was. He put the bag over his shoulder and walked through the building, through the east corridor, through the main atrium where the conference setup was being dismantled now, chairs stacked and cable runs coiled, the grand hall returning to its ordinary dimensions. And he thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill he'd had to learn the hard way and still wasn't perfect at, but was getting better. In the main atrium, he passed one of the federal security agents who had been on the president's protective detail. The agent stopped and looked at him with an expression that wasn't quite sure how to handle itself. Sir, the agent said. Caleb looked at him. The president asked me to relay something. He said, the agent paused, clearly working from memory. He said the record will be set straight, all of it, and that he's sorry it took this long. Caleb held that for a moment. Tell him I said okay, he said. The agent nodded, and Caleb walked past him through the main atrium, past the front desk where the overnight security guard would arrive in a couple of hours, and make his coffee and settle in for the long, quiet shift, and out through the loading dock entrance into the afternoon, which was gray and cool and smelled faintly like rain. He sat in his car for a moment before starting it. The ring on his hand caught what light there was. He looked at it, the way he looked at it sometimes when he had a spare moment, and the specific kind of quiet that allowed for it. The compass rose, worn nearly smooth now, the engraving visible if you knew to look for it. He thought about Derek Sloan, who had spent 6 years holding a truth that had been taken from both of them and had built something destructive trying to force it into the open, and who was now in federal custody accounting for what he'd built. He thought about the complexity of that, not the judgment of it, which wasn't his to make, but the shape of it. The way grief and rage and time could do things to a person that the person couldn't fully see from the inside. He thought about Mason, the way he always did, but today the thought had a different quality to it. Not lighter exactly, but different. Like a thing that had been in the same position for 14 years had shifted slightly, settling into a new arrangement of the same weight. He started the car. He had 20 minutes before he needed to pick up Tessa. On the way, he stopped at the noodle place and ordered ahead because she would ask, and he already knew the answer, and there was something about walking in with the answer already handled that felt, on this particular day, like exactly the right thing to do. The noodles were lukewarm by the time they got home. Tessa didn't complain. She was in the middle of a detailed account of a disagreement she'd had with a classmate named Owen about whether a platypus was technically a bird. And the disagreement had apparently consumed most of the afternoon and involved the teacher being called in to mediate, which Tessa felt was unnecessary because she had been correct from the beginning, and the evidence supported her position fully. Caleb listened and stirred his noodles and said, at the appropriate intervals and watched his daughter eat with the focused intensity she brought to everything she cared about, which was most things. A platypus is a mammal, she said, for what he estimated was the fourth time. It is, he said. Owen said it lays eggs, so it's basically a bird. Lots of things lay eggs that aren't birds. She pointed her fork at him. That's what I said. Then you were right. I know I was right. She went back to her noodles, satisfied. Then, after a moment, were you okay today? Mrs. Aldridge said there was something on the news about your building. He looked at her. She was 7, and she asked questions the way 7-year-olds asked questions, directly, without understanding the full weight of what she was asking, but also without the social filter that would eventually teach her to ask things more carefully. He'd always appreciated that about her. It kept him honest. It was a complicated day, he said. Did you fix the problem? Yeah, I fixed it. She considered this with the same gravity she'd given the platypus debate. Good, she said, and went back to eating, and that was that. He did the dishes. She did homework at the kitchen table, occasionally asking him to check her spelling, which he did while drying plates, calling the answers from the kitchen without looking at the worksheet because she needed to write the words, not watch him read them. They had a system. It worked. At 8:30, he sat on the edge of her bed while she settled in, the specific nightly ritual of blanket arrangement and pillow positioning that she took seriously and that he had learned not to rush. When everything was arranged to her satisfaction, she looked up at him with the particular look she got sometimes, the one that meant she was going to say something that had been sitting with her for a while. Dad, she said. Yeah. Were you scared today? He thought about the locked doors and the device in the conduit and the sound of the building's intercom broadcasting a code name that had lived in the back of his chest for 14 years. He thought about the president's hands around his and the silence in the grand hall and moving through a crowd while 300 people were trying to figure out what was happening. A little, he said. Not the way you'd think, though. What way were you scared? He considered how to answer that honestly in a way she could hold. The kind of scared where you're not scared for yourself. You're scared for everyone else around you, and that kind of scared keeps you moving instead of freezing up. She thought about this. That sounds like a better kind of scared. It is, he said. It really is. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Uncle Mason was brave like that? His throat tightened, just slightly, the way it always did when she said Mason's name. She'd never met him, had only ever known him through stories and photographs, and the ring on Caleb's hand that he'd explained to her when she was 5, in terms simple enough for 5 but true enough to hold up under everything that came after. Uncle Mason was brave. Uncle Mason was Daddy's big brother. Uncle Mason didn't come home from his job, but he made sure other people could come home to theirs. Yeah, Caleb said, exactly like that. She nodded, satisfied, the way she got satisfied when something confirmed what she'd already understood. She reached up and touched the ring on his hand, briefly, the way she had since she was small, like checking that it was still there. Then she pulled her hand back and closed her eyes and was, with the efficiency of childhood, asleep within 4 minutes. He sat there a little longer than he needed to. The first official call came 3 days later. Not from the media. He'd declined everything media-related through a one-line email that Ashford had helped him draft, which said simply that he was not available for comment and would not be for the foreseeable future and contained no other information. The calls from reporters went to voicemail and stayed there. He didn't feel bad about this. He'd spent 14 years being invisible, and he didn't experience the prospect of a news cycle as a reward. The call that mattered came from a woman named Vera Okafor, who introduced herself as a senior analyst with the Federal Oversight Committee that had been tasked with reviewing the North Star classification and the intelligence sourcing documents that Derek Sloan had provided. She had a direct voice and no unnecessary words, which Caleb appreciated, and she told him that the documentation was being formally entered into the review process, that an independent investigative panel had been convened, and that Sterling Wainwright had been charged with 4 federal counts, including conspiracy and deliberate obstruction of a classified military operation. "The charges will be public within the week," she said. "What about the soldiers who didn't come home?" Caleb said. "The formal record, their names, their service, what they were actually doing when they died. That's part of the declassification process. It won't happen overnight. These things move. Slowly," he said. "I know. I'm not asking for overnight. I'm asking whether it's going to happen." A brief pause. "Yes," she said. "It's going to happen. I can tell you that with confidence because the documentation Sloan provided is extensive, and because the president has personally indicated that the declassification process is a priority. The families of the other men," Caleb said, "Marcus Webb's family, Dominic Reyes' family. Before anything goes public, someone needs to sit down with them in person, not a letter, not a call, a person in their house, explaining what happened and what it meant and what's coming. I've already assigned someone to—" "I'd like to be part of that," Caleb said, "if the families are open to it." A longer pause. "I'll make that request." "Thank you," he said. He called in a personal day from Jefferson Federal, which Gary approved without asking questions because Gary had developed, over the last week, the particular quality of loyalty that comes from having stood at a breaker box in a utility substation and cut power on someone's word and been right to do it. Whatever Caleb needed, Gary was going to try to provide it. This was not a dynamic Caleb had sought out, but he accepted it with the genuine gratitude of a man who had spent a long time not having much of it. He drove to see Marcus Webb's mother on a Thursday. She lived in a small house in a suburb 2 hours south, the kind of neighborhood where the lawns were kept and the houses were modest and people had been there long enough that they knew their neighbors' names. Her name was Gloria, and she was 63, and when she opened the door and saw Caleb standing on her porch, she looked at him for a long moment before she said anything. "You served with him," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." She stepped back and let him in. They sat in her living room for 2 hours. She had photographs of Marcus on every surface, not in a shrine-like way, just the natural accumulation of a woman who loved her son and had put his pictures where she could see them. Caleb looked at the photographs while they talked and thought about the Marcus Webb he remembered, who had been louder than anyone else on the team and who had made the worst coffee Caleb had ever tasted and who had moved through dangerous spaces with a particular kind of grace that Caleb had always thought was underappreciated. He told her some of that. Not all of it. Not the parts she didn't need. Not the details that would only make the loss more specific in ways that wouldn't help her. He told her what Marcus had been like to work with. He told her that Marcus had been afraid on that mission because everyone had been afraid, and that Marcus had done his job anyway, which was the only definition of courage that Caleb had ever found useful. He told her that Marcus had talked about her, that in the particular way men talk about their families in tight spaces before something uncertain, her son had made clear that she was someone he thought about. Gloria Webb didn't cry, or if she did, it was in the private way of someone who had already done most of their crying, and what was left was something quieter. She asked questions that Caleb answered as honestly as he could. She thanked him for coming in person, and he said that it was the least that was owed, and she looked at him with the clear eyes of someone who had spent 14 years not knowing and said, "It helps. I didn't know if it would, but it does." He drove home in the dark. He stopped once at a gas station off the highway and sat in the parked car for a few minutes doing nothing in particular. The fluorescent lights of the station were very bright against the night. A truck pulled in and the driver got out and stretched and went inside for coffee. An ordinary thing happening in an ordinary place at an ordinary hour, while Caleb sat with what the last 2 hours had put in him. The grief that was other people's grief, and also his own, and also something that didn't fully have a name. He sat with it. He didn't try to move it along. Eventually, he started the car and drove the rest of the way home. The Wainwright trial, when it came, was public in the way that things become public when the people involved are sufficiently powerful and the crimes are sufficiently serious. Caleb did not follow it closely. He read the initial coverage, which was significant, and then he stopped reading because he'd found in his life that there was a threshold past which following a thing stopped being informative and started being something else, something that ate time without giving anything back. What he knew: Sterling Wainwright had run an intelligence manipulation operation for a foreign-aligned private interest group that had wanted the North Star mission to fail, had sourced deliberately incorrect extraction route data to the mission's logistical chain, and had spent the subsequent 14 years in a senior role at a government-adjacent company that gave him the access to help ensure the records stayed buried. The indictment was 43 pages. The evidence, largely from Sloan's documentation supplemented by the federal investigation that followed, was described by legal analysts as unusually comprehensive. Wainwright's attorneys called it a misunderstanding. His attorneys were very expensive and very good at their jobs and were going to argue this particular misunderstanding for the better part of 2 years in federal court. Caleb did not feel the need to watch that process. The thing had been set in motion. It would resolve the way these things resolved: imperfectly, slowly, with outcomes that didn't fully satisfy anyone and that didn't bring anyone back, but that established for the record what had happened and who had been responsible. That was what the process was for. He'd accepted a long time ago that process and justice were related, but not identical, and that expecting them to be identical was how you ended up angry at something that was never going to change. Derek Sloan pled guilty to 4 counts related to the unlawful installation of surveillance and control hardware in a federal facility and the unauthorized disruption of a secured government event. His sentencing took into account his cooperation with the subsequent Wainwright investigation, which had been substantial, and his documented history of attempting to bring the North Star intelligence failure through legitimate channels before resorting to what he'd built in the Jefferson Federal Mechanical Room. The judge, by all accounts, spent considerable time on the record acknowledging the complexity of the situation before determining what accountability looked like for a man whose methods had been wrong and whose reasons had not been simple. Caleb submitted a written statement to the court. He'd spent 3 evenings writing it. It was not short, and it was not uncomplicated, because the situation was not short and was not uncomplicated, and he thought the court deserved something that reflected that rather than something easier. He said that what Derek had done had put people in danger and that this was not excusable. He also said that Derek had carried a truth for 6 years that the system had refused to hold, and that the thing he had done with that truth was wrong, and also that the conditions that had produced it were not nothing. He said that he did not know how to weigh those things against each other, and that he was not asking the court to weigh them in any particular way. He said only that he wanted the full picture considered, because incomplete pictures were what had caused all of this in the first place. He did not attend the sentencing. He went to work. The formal declassification of Operation North Star happened 6 months after the conference. There was a ceremony, small and deliberately quiet, at a federal building that Caleb had not been to before. He wore the same dark jacket he wore to every formal occasion, which Tessa had told him needed to be replaced, and which he had agreed with and not yet acted on. The other 2 surviving team members were there. Caleb had spoken to both of them by phone before any of this became public. Long calls that had the specific quality of conversations between people who shared something that most people couldn't access, where a lot of what needed to be said got communicated in the pauses rather than the words. The families of Marcus Webb and Dominic Reyes were there. Gloria Webb sat 2 seats from Caleb and nodded at him when he came in, a small nod that carried everything it needed to carry. There were official statements read into the record. The names of the 4 men who had conducted Operation North Star were entered formally into the archive with their correct designations and their correct service records, correcting what had been listed for 14 years as administrative separation or incomplete records. Mason Danner's name was read aloud by a federal archivist in a voice that was careful and even, and Caleb sat with his hands on his knees and listened to his brother's name in a room full of people who now knew what it meant. And he did not look away from the front of the room, and he did not try to manage what was happening in his chest. He let it be there. After, outside on the steps, one of the other surviving team members, a man named Torres who had settled in New Mexico and had the look of someone who had built a life that fit him, stood next to Caleb, and they watched the families talking to the officials, and neither of them said anything for a while. "You think he would have hated this," Torres said finally. "The ceremony part. He would have complained about it the whole way there," Caleb said, "and then he would have stood at attention the whole time and not moved a muscle." Torres made a sound that was mostly air through his nose. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, that's right." They stood there a little longer and then shook hands, and Torres said he had a flight to catch, and Caleb said safe travels, and that was that. He took the security advisor position at Carrington Strategic Systems. Not immediately. He thought about it for 6 weeks, which was longer than Evelyn had expected, based on the phone call where she said carefully that she didn't want to pressure him, and then proceeded to make a very good case, which he appreciated because he preferred an honest attempt at persuasion to a performed indifference. He thought about what the job actually was, which was not a title or a salary but a function. The function of being the person in the room who made sure that the next Caleb Danner, whoever they were and whatever they found, got heard before it mattered instead of after. He also negotiated 2 conditions that he told Evelyn were non-negotiable, and which she agreed to without making him explain them at length, which he took as a sign that she'd understood something important about why he was considering the job at all. The first condition was that his title would not appear in any external communications, press releases, or marketing materials. He was not interested in being the company's decorated veteran face. He was interested in doing the work. The second condition was that he would maintain a part-time capacity at Jefferson Federal for the first year, because he had unfinished maintenance work orders, and because Gary had nobody else who knew the East Mechanical Room the way he knew it, and because some part of him needed the continuity of the work he'd been doing, the physical, concrete daily reality of fixing broken things in a building that needed them fixed. Evelyn had said, in the specific dry tone she used when she found something genuinely funny but wasn't going to perform laughing at it, "You're negotiating to keep your old job." "Part of it," he said. "Fine," she said. "Done." He started the following Monday. The thing about the months that followed was that they were mostly ordinary. That sounds like a small thing, and it wasn't. Ordinary was something Caleb had chosen deliberately and had spent years building, and had found, in the weeks after the conference, that he was afraid of losing. Not because the extraordinary had been good, but because extraordinary had a gravity to it, a pull toward the next version of itself, and he had seen enough of what that pull did to people to be cautious about it. He drove Tessa to school. He made the triangular sandwiches. He went to work and did the work, and came home and made dinner, and helped with homework, and sat in his kitchen in the evening sometimes with a cup of coffee that got cold while he was thinking, not about anything specific, just the ordinary ambient thinking of a man who was processing a lot of things at a pace that suited him, rather than a pace that suited anyone else. He had a conversation with Evelyn one evening in November, after a late meeting about a security protocol review, when most of the office had emptied out and they were the last 2 people in the conference room with the remains of bad takeout between them. She asked him a question that surprised him, which was whether he was doing okay. And the surprise was not that she asked it, but that she asked it in a way that made clear she wanted an honest answer rather than a functional one. He thought about it for a moment. "I'm doing okay," he said. "I mean that literally, not as a social answer. What does okay look like for you?" "My daughter told me this morning that I've been making the sandwiches wrong for 2 weeks, and she didn't want to say anything, but she felt I should know." Evelyn looked at him. "I switched to a serrated knife instead of a straight blade," he said. "Apparently it changes the texture of the cut edge, and this affects the eating experience." "That's very specific feedback." "She's a very specific person." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, "You know what I think the most surprising thing about you has been? I'm going to guess it's not the sandwich engineering." Something crossed her face that was close to a smile. "You had every reason to be angry. At me, at the company, at Vale, at the whole situation. And you weren't. Not in a way I could see anyway." Caleb thought about that. "I was angry," he said. "I was angry about Mason for 14 years. About what was taken from him, and what was taken from the rest of us. I was angry at the system that buried it, and the people who benefited from it staying buried." He paused. "But angry at you specifically for not knowing what you didn't know? That seemed like the wrong place to put it." "Most people put it where it's available," she said. Most people do, he agreed. I've just had a lot of time to think about what anger's actually useful for and what it isn't. She looked at him with the expression he'd come to recognize, the one that meant she was revising her estimate, which she did periodically, and which he respected because she never pretended the revision wasn't happening. For what it's worth, she said, I think about that first day a lot. The security coordination room. What I should have seen. Stop, he said, not unkindly. I'm not flagellating myself. I'm just saying, I know what you're saying, but you've been different every day since then. That's what actually matters. He picked up his coffee cup, found it cold, put it back down. You don't have to keep apologizing for who you were before you had the information. You just have to be different now that you have it. She was quiet for a long time. Is that how you deal with things? You give people exactly what they have coming and not more? I try, he said. I'm not perfect at it. You seem pretty good at it. Ask Derek Sloan, he said, and meant it as something dry, and Evelyn did make a sound that was close to a laugh, and the November evening sat around them, and the office was quiet. But he visited Mason's grave on a Saturday in December. It was the kind of cold that was clear rather than harsh, the sky a pale, clean blue with no clouds, the ground frozen, but the paths clear. He went alone. He didn't bring anything because he'd never been sure what the etiquette of bringing things to graves was, and had decided a long time ago to just bring himself, which seemed like enough. He stood there for a while. He didn't talk out loud. He'd tried that once, years ago, and it had felt like performing something for an audience that wasn't there. And he was not a person who performed things for absent audiences. He just stood and let himself be in the place and thought about his brother in the imprecise way that you think about someone you've lost, which is not like remembering so much as like tuning a frequency that you know exists but can only partially pick up. He thought about what Mason would make of all of this. The conference, the device, the locked doors, the president's hands around his, the ceremony with the archivist reading names, Wainwright in a federal courtroom, Derek Sloan accounting for what he'd done, Caleb in a new job with a part-time arrangement because he still needed to fix the East Mechanical Room's cable tray. He thought Mason would have had opinions about all of it, specific and unsolicited, and that some of those opinions would have been right and some would have been wrong, and all of them would have been delivered while standing in the kitchen eating cereal because sitting down for breakfast was a waste of the morning. He turned the ring on his finger. 4 words. Keep living, little brother. It was a small thing to carry for 14 years, and also the most important thing he owned, not because of what it was made of, but because of what it had asked of him. Not to be a hero, not to be remembered, just to keep going, in the ordinary, imperfect daily way that a life requires, showing up for the people who needed him to show up and doing the work that needed doing, and not requiring the world to acknowledge any of it. He'd kept that promise. Not perfectly. There had been years when the living had been more mechanical than genuine, years when he'd gone through the motions of a life while something essential had been turned down low. But he'd kept going, and he'd found Tessa, and he'd built something out of the years that were his to build with, and it wasn't the life Mason had imagined when he'd pressed the ring into Caleb's hand in the dark, because Mason hadn't imagined a specific life, he'd just asked for a living one. That was what Caleb had. He stood at the grave until he was cold, which took a while because he dressed for it. Then he said his brother's name once, quietly, to the frozen ground and the pale blue sky and whatever the standing there was worth. Then he walked back to his car. On the drive home, Tessa called him, which she did sometimes on weekend mornings when she was at a friend's house and had remembered something important she needed to tell him. "Dad," she said. "Hey, I looked it up. A platypus is a monotreme. That's a mammal that lays eggs. Owen was right that it lays eggs, but wrong about the bird part." A pause. "I'm going to tell him on Monday that you were both partially right. That I was more right," she said firmly. "Mammal is the correct category. Eggs are a subcategory." That's a reasonable position. "I know." She sounded satisfied. "Are you getting lunch?" "I'm driving. I'll be home in an hour." "Can we make soup? It's cold." He looked at the pale blue sky through the windshield, the winter light sitting flat and clear over the highway, and the fields on either side, and the ordinary landscape of a December Saturday. "Yeah," he said, We can make soup. I'll get out the pot, she said, with the particular gravity of someone who understands that getting out the pot is a meaningful contribution to the process, and hung up. He drove. The ring caught the winter light. He let it. There was something he'd learned, not all at once, but over years, in the accumulation of ordinary days and small decisions, and the specific work of building a life out of what remained after you'd lost something you couldn't replace. He'd learned that invisible labor was not lesser labor, that the person everyone walked past was not less present than the person everyone saw, that the work of protecting people rarely looked like protection from the outside. It looked like maintenance work, like early mornings, like filed reports that nobody read and cables that nobody noticed and doors that opened because someone had replaced their worn gaskets before the conference. He'd learned that the people who actually hold things together are usually the ones you don't see holding them. Not because they hide themselves, but because the holding itself is quiet, and quiet things don't announce what they are. He'd spent 3 years in a building fixing what it needed. Fixed, and nobody had looked twice at him, and that was fine, that had always been fine. Because the building worked and the lights came on and the doors opened and the people inside it went about their days not knowing that someone had made those days possible by arriving early and staying late and caring about a cable that didn't belong in a conduit. That was the job, not the ceremony, not the acknowledgement, not the president's hands around his in a silent room. The job was the daily thing. The job was showing up. He'd done it before anyone knew his name, and he would keep doing it after the news cycle moved on and the federal trial concluded and the world's attention went where it always went, which was forward, toward the next thing, away from the last. He would make soup with his daughter and help with her homework and fix the cable tray in the East Corridor and go to work on Monday, and come home on Monday evening and do it all again on Tuesday. He would wear the ring on his right hand until it wore down to nothing, and after that he would carry it some other way, because some things you don't put down. Tessa would ask him again someday, when she was older and the question had more weight to it, what it had been like. He would tell her as honestly as he could, which meant telling her it was not the way she would have imagined it, that the hard parts were not the dramatic ones, but the quiet ones, the years of carrying something with nowhere to put it, the particular loneliness of knowing something true that nobody would let you say. He would tell her that what had kept him going was not heroism, which he found to be an unreliable fuel, but something more like stubbornness. The refusal to let a building fall apart on his watch. The refusal to leave a bad cable undocumented. The refusal to let what his brother had done become invisible because it was inconvenient for it to be seen. He would tell her that her Uncle Mason had been the kind of person who made you want to be better than you were, not by being perfect, but by being so completely himself, so fully and stubbornly present in his own life, that it made you feel the cost of being anything less. And he would tell her, because it was true, and she deserved the true things, that keeping a promise to someone who can no longer hold you to it is the hardest kind of promise to keep, and also the most important one. Keep living, little brother. He had. He was. He took the exit for home, where a pot was already on the stove, and a 7-year-old with strong opinions about sandwich geometry and mammalian taxonomy was waiting for him. And the afternoon was cold and clear and entirely ordinary, and that was everything.